Rabbi Sacks, thank you for joining me today. Can I start with a very simple question? What is the central animating idea in the book? The one that, if you only had 1 minute, as in this interview, to impart to the reader, you would seek to impress upon them?
If you want to understand religiously motivated violence, then you have to understand the religion, not just the violence. So you have to go back to theology. You have to go back to sacred texts. You have to go back to sacred texts which, interpreted literally and applied directly, lead to violence. And it then turns out that probably all the world's great religions have potentially violent texts within their literatures. And therefore, we are going to have to look at this again. It is the one thing that nobody expected in the 21st century. We've been through 4 centuries of secularization in the West, and people assumed that everyone who is going to become modern is going to become modern the Western way by secularizing. What's happening in the Middle East is therefore completely unexpected. It's taken us continuously by surprise. Despite all the think tanks and the future-oriented institutes, virtually no one saw 9/11 coming. And out of nowhere, ISIS has emerged as a global force, perpetrating acts of violence in multiple continents within the space of weeks. And it seems to me that we've been continuously caught by surprise in the West because we never thought through what is religiously motivated violence. We haven't seen it in centuries.
There's a lot in what you've said that we can unpack. If we start with this sort of concept of the group and religion, you mentioned that religion has been a helpful way of binding groups together, and that 4 centuries, if you like, of secularization has been an attempt in the West, perhaps sometimes to bring those groups apart again, or at least replace the ideas with something else. And yet we have failed. And I will quote you a piece you've written, which is, you say, "Try as the West may, the tribes keep coming back, angrier each time." What are we doing wrong?
Well, what we are doing wrong is assuming that you can have human beings without identities. That was the great fantasy of the West in the 18th century. Don't forget, in the 16th and 17th centuries, you had Protestants and Catholics murdering each other throughout Europe, beginning in France, extending to Germany. Major upheavals everywhere. So the 18th century said, let's get beyond Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Christian. Let's just deal with things that are universal, science and reason. And that was the 18th century. Let us only think in things that are universal, that are common to all humanity. Of course, in the 19th century, all those suppressed identities came roaring back, some in the form of the nation state. The new religion was nationalism, others in the form of race, the Aryan race, racism, Nazi, which became Nazism, and others again in terms of economic ideology, Marxism. So those were the bits of identity that came roaring back in the 19th century, and there were all 3 of them substitutes for religion. They turned out to be even bloodier than religion. Somehow the nationalism led to 2 world wars, race led to the Holocaust, Marxist communism led to Stalin, the KGB and the Gulag. In all, 100 million innocent lives murdered in the name of substitutes for religion. In the second half of the 20th century, people searched for another alternative. Let's forget about the universal. Let's just abolish identity altogether and only talk about the individual. And the individual, as individual, is the hero of market economics and the liberal democratic state. Give me choices, that's the market. Give me the freedom to make those choices, that's the liberal democratic state. And for the rest, just leave me alone. It is the I, the iPhone, the iPad, the selfie. This is an age that abolished identity, not in the name of universalism, but in the name of individualism. And yet again, the tribes come roaring back, this time in the form of radical politicized Islam.
Let's come back to the issue of religious texts.
Yeah.
You've written, never say I hate, I kill, because my religion says so. Every text needs interpretation. How did Judaism solve its own textual problems, and is this a guide for other religions to follow?
No religion solves its textual problems without being forced to do so by disaster. What happened basically was that Jews went through the kind of conflicts that Christianity went through in the 16th and 17th century, the kind of conflicts that Islam is going through now. It went through them in the first century, in the last years of the Second Temple, when Judaism was so fissured and fragmented into Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes. Even the Pharisees themselves were divided into the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai, and the rabbis said, it seemed as if the Torah had become two Torahs. There were two Judaisms even within that particular bit of the Jewish world. And then within the besieged Jerusalem, there were the moderates who favored accommodation with Rome. There were the zealots. And there were the ultra-zealots, who were probably the first recorded religious terrorists. They were called sicarii. They went around stabbing people with daggers, not unlike the situation that's recently been developing in Israel itself. So we were there at the beginning of all this. The end result of this was a disaster of defeat by Rome, destruction of the temple in the year 70, the last outpost of resistance, Masada, the people surrounded there committing collective suicide rather than be taken captive by the Romans. People tried again in the days of Bar Kokhba 60 years later, which led to an even bigger disaster. And that became a self-inflicted tragedy from which it took Jews almost 2,000 years to recover. It is when you suffer self-inflicted tragedy that reasonable and reflective individuals sit back and say, this cannot be what God wants. And that is when you get people radically rereading texts. And the whole of rabbinic Judaism is a radical rereading of biblical texts. It's what we call midrash.
And can you see such a circumstance developing in the next 5, 10, 15, 50 years for other religions?
Well, Christianity, of course, went through this in the 17th century. And you had an extraordinary group of thinkers, John Milton, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, together with a fairly radical Jew called Baruch Spinoza in Amsterdam, sitting and reading Tanakh, reading the Hebrew Bible, and coming up with the 5 ideas that made the modern world. Social contract, the moral limits of power, liberty of conscience, the doctrine of toleration, and human rights. All of those 5 concepts born in the 17th century through a radical, fresh look at the biblical texts. Even the atheist Thomas Paine, writing Common Sense, the thing that is the tract that was supposed to have launched the American Revolution in 1776, begins by a long analysis of the Hebrew Bible. So Jews did it in the early rabbinical era. Christians did it in the 17th century. Muslims have already done it. They did it between the 8th and 12th centuries, when the great scholars of Islam reclaimed the lost heritage of ancient Greece, which had been almost forgotten during the Dark Ages, and brought back Plato and Aristotle into circulation through these extraordinary thinkers, Averroes, Avicenna, Al-Farabi, and others. And of course, especially in Al-Andalus in Spain, developed what, by medieval standards, was a tolerant environment of coexistence. It was called convivencia. We see what impact it had on Judaism. Islam had a huge impact on Judaism. Moses Maimonides, in the Guide of the Perplexed, is in constant dialogue with the Mutakalimun, with the Kalam, the Islamic philosophical tradition. Even his Mishneh Torah, his unsurpassed code of Jewish law, he wrote because he saw that Jews lacked a code of law similar to the kind of code that Muslims had of Sharia. Even his formulation of the animating, of the 13 principles of Jewish faith, came about because Muslims had a creed, Christians had a creed, Jews had no creed. So Moses Maimonides, the greatest rabbi of the Middle Ages, learnt a lot of what he did through Islamic inspiration. His son, Rabbi Avram, was particularly close to the Sufi mystical tradition within Islam. Islam gave Hebrew poets their first use of rhyme. Hebrew poetry never rhymed before the 9th century. Biblical poetry is done by meter and parallelism, not by rhyme. That comes to Judaism from within in Islam. So in a sense, Islam doesn't have to invent something it never encountered before. It merely has to recover its great tradition.
Be more explicit about this recovery and the need for Islam to confront its problems. I mean, in the book you state, for example, there is a creed that is promoting hatred through school systems, by which I presume you mean Wahhabism, which is emphatically not the kind of Islam you've just extolled now. Do we need to confront this head on?
Wahhabi Islam is a creation of the 19th century and of a particular deal that the leaders of what is today Saudi Arabia made with that group of clerics. It was a very, very minor strand of Islam until relatively recently. What happened, of course, was after the huge hike in oil prices in the 1970s and that enormous wealth, much of it was used to fund madrasas in various parts of the world, most conspicuously in Pakistan, teaching this very extreme form of Islam. And what we've seen ever since 9/11 and Al-Qaeda, and more emphatically since 2014 and the emergence of ISIS, almost from nowhere, seemingly, is that somehow or other that voice of moderation has only rarely been heard within Islam. President al-Sisi of Egypt has had the courage to do so, but he's not a religious leader. And we are very short of religious leaders who've said so. Everyone will always, out of common politeness, out of a sense of moral decency, will say, this kind of terror and violence is not Islam. But they have not yet said, here is a kind of Islam that clearly is different in the way it sees the world and interprets its texts. So what is the rest of the world supposed to do? Sit and do nothing? No, what you do is you say, guys, here am I as a Jewish thinker telling you how we dealt with this within Judaism. I would hope Christian thinkers would say how they dealt with it within Christianity, although I've done that in the book as well, because they've done it. And I've done it really to encourage the emergence of moderate voices within Islam, because that's the most important thing we can do right now. We can't do it for Islam, but we can provide an environment where young Muslims say, you know what, that makes sense to me, let's do that.
That's great for the case of Islam in specifics. More generally, then, my final question to you, how can we win this battle against religious violence collectively?
Well, don't think it's going to be easy. I mean, Neil Ferguson wrote an article recently in which he challenged people who used the term, which the late Christopher Hitchens invented, Islamofascism. Now, that is a very misleading word because fascism was built around the nation state. You could conceive of defeating Nazism by defeating Germany. Well, Islam is not predicated on a nation state. ISIS is not a geographically confined phenomenon. It can crop up in London and in California and in Libya and in bringing down a Russian airline, taking off from Sinai. I mean, it can. So this is a much bigger challenge than the world has ever faced before. It is big and it is serious. And those who think it can be dealt with purely by political means or purely by military means are making an enormous mistake. It took pretty much 50 years for this extreme strand, which was active certainly from, let's say, Wahhabism from the 19th century and the Muslim Brotherhood from 1928. But one way or another, if it took 50 years to grow extremism, it will take 50 years to grow a cogent and compelling alternative to it. But you begin now, and you have to be as long-term and as patient and as deliberate as the extremists have been. So there's no quick fix for this. And if we continue to believe there is a quick fix, by aerial bombing campaigns, for instance, or even by Syria's ground forces in Syria and Iraq, let me guarantee you that if the West defeats ISIS utterly and completely, it will reappear again within 5 years somewhere else under a different name, the exact same phenomenon. People are not fully yet understanding how big, how deep, and how long-term this takes. And I hope our short attention spans will not be the death of us. Let's get going now. Let us rouse the conscience of good and thoughtful Muslims and Jews and Christians, and let us not forget that Hindus and Buddhists and Sikhs are all involved in their own local forms of religiously motivated violence. Buddhists in Myanmar and Hindu nationalists in India, and so on. This is a huge global issue. We were not prepared for the re-emergence of religion as an earth-shaking force. Religion brings out some of the best in human beings, but it also provides justification for some of the worst. So we have got to fight the battle for the better angels of our nature. The sooner we begin, the better. And the more we do so in the company of good, moderate Muslims, Christians, and others, the better it will be for all of us.
Rabbi Lord Sacks, thank you for an uplifting end to a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.